So I want to start by talking about Kevin Spacey. All right, so last month you have this very renowned, highly decorated actor who's outed as a pedophile, adding his name to the ever-growing list of sexual predators in Hollywood. And as a sort of smokescreen to cover up the allegations against him, he comes out as gay. And people see right through it. He rightfully faces a massive amount of backlash, but it's the wrong kind of backlash. Because instead of the conversation being, Kevin Spacey's a pedophile and thought he could trick us, it becomes, Kevin Spacey insults gay men by using sexuality to cover up pedophilia allegations. And that's absolutely an issue that should be talked about, the stereotype that gay men are pedophiles. But it's the wrong time for that particular conversation because it gave Kevin Spacey exactly what he wanted. It allowed him to spin that scandal into being about something other than what it was, which was childhood sexual assault, which I'm going to refer to as CSA from here on out. And this isn't honestly all that uncommon. On the whole, people care about CSA survivors a lot less than they like to think they do. Like you ask any given person, like, oh, what are your thoughts on pedophilia? They're going to tell you that it's awful and evil and vile. But once you start criticizing the sexualization of children and teenagers in the media, or school dress codes, or the role that pedophilia plays in comedy, a lot of those same people are a lot less vocal. For example, daddy jokes. A lot of people have heard of the daddy jokes. And it's a sexualized term that you use to describe yourself or your hot friend. And it's become super common, especially with millennials. And because it's become so common, the context and origin of the word has largely been forgotten. But the word comes from a kink, a sexual role play called Daddy Dom Little Girl, in which one partner takes on the role of a parental figure and the other of a child. And so for CSA survivors, like hearing this kind of language thrown around very casually is obviously very triggering and upsetting. I am a survivor. I was molested by an adult man when I was 6 years old, and he was not a father figure to me. But even so, like hearing the daddy jokes thrown around will set me off for, at minimum, the entire rest of that day, because it's a reminder of how pervasive this stuff is and how little empathy people really have for the experiences of survivors when we're children, much less when we're older and supposed to have outgrown the trauma. And for other survivors, like my best friend Vegas, who was raped by his stepfather for years, like that holds an even more sinister connotation. And you know, Vegas and I are both very vocal about this stuff, like in person and on social media, and it's one thing when people just don't know, because you can explain to them the context and what it really means, and they have their moment of like, oh my God, I had no idea, and then they can change their behavior. But what's much more common is you have people who, no matter if you talk to them one-on-one, no matter how many times they hear you talk about this stuff, it's inconvenient for them to reevaluate their behavior, or they don't want to accept that it's actually harmful, so they just don't stop. And because of that and the stuff you just hear day to day, it's very hard to go more than like a day or two without being reminded of your status as a survivor and being reminded of how isolating that is. I think something a lot of people don't realize is how much being assaulted in childhood impacts the entire rest of your life. It's not, well, you were little and so, you know, kids don't have real feelings, and once you're older, you're fine. Because when you are raped as a child, your brain is dealing with some heavy adult stuff before it's a fully developed adult brain. And when you're in this very specific window of 6 to 9 years old, your brain's at a very sensitive stage of cognitive and emotional development. And as a means of coping, in the context of this talk, I'm going to be talking specifically in regards to pedophilia, but any kinds of abuse experienced in that 6 to 9 year window. As a means of processing what's happening, your brain can create a new identity. A lot of people are familiar with multiple personalities disorder, which is the outdated term for what's known today as dissociative identity disorder, or DID. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions about DID is tied up in the word personality, because people hear that and it's easy to conceptualize it as like putting on a mask or playing a character, which makes it very easy to discount DID as like just a delusion, or, well, sure, we believe he believes it, but we all know he's crazy. Because the thing is, your brain is really, really good at what it does, so it goes all the way in when it creates someone new, and that person is not like a two-dimensional character. It's a real, fully developed person, just as real as the kid who was there first. So the term, we don't use personality, the term we use is alter. And because most people with DID have more than just one alter, the term for all alters collectively is a system. So once you have this system that's created, any other traumas that occur throughout the lifetime have the potential to create new alters. So the person who this body originally belonged to, her name is Maddie, and she was, like I said, molested when we were 6. And so it's Maddie, and then Percy and Mal were the first 2 alters that showed up as a result of that initial trauma. And then when we were in high school, Maddie was in an abusive relationship for a few years. And I, Ross, was created during that time to help her cope. And a few years after that, once we were able to finally get away from the abusive girlfriend for good, Maddie was essentially like, I'm very small and my life has been garbage and I don't want to be here anymore, it's your turn. So she sort of went into hibernation and left me to run things. Fox showed up not too long after that, and after him, Sawyer, Bucky, and Steve. So there's 8 of us in our system. And I think people have, it's easier to understand the difference between alters by interacting with them rather than just hearing about them. So we're actually going to have Fox take over for a little bit. Please excuse the voice crack. We're going to have Fox take over for a little bit. Hey, just as a disclaimer, this isn't like a party trick. We don't usually just turn it on and off. We can, but we don't. We have this, we've rehearsed this. But anyway, like Ross said, my name is Fox. The term for what I'm doing right now, talking, interacting with the world, controlling our body, is called fronting. We've worked really hard within our system to have strong internal communication, which allows us to have pretty good control over who is fronting when. We've known other systems with significantly poorer communication who have little to no control over who pops in and out. So I wanted to talk about one of the biggest misconceptions, second biggest, I guess, misconceptions about DID is one that you see perpetuated in the media a lot. You have it in movies like Split, or that one episode of any given crime procedural drama where it's, this person has DID and one of their alters is a serial killer. Can they be stopped? And the thing about that, aside from the fact that it's wildly untrue, is that the trope plays off of existing stereotypes about DID, which paint it as one of the quote-unquote scarier mental illnesses, as opposed to, say, anxiety and depression. Because for most people, it's hard to imagine, sharing your body and head with other people. But the thing is, the best way I can articulate DID is it's like living with roommates, only they're inside your head, right? If you can't communicate, you're gonna have problems. Some of you are significantly worse at remembering to do the dishes. And you inhabit the same physical space. So another question we get whenever we talk about our communication is how logistically that works. Think about any form of media you've interacted with in which someone can read minds, and they hear other people's thoughts inside their own head, but all the voices sound different because they're all coming from different people. Again, because alters, we're all our own distinct people, we all have our own distinct voices. So it's literally just internal communication, sharing thoughts and feelings. And because, like I say, this is media, right? Media tends to be very stigmatizing when talking about mental health in general, but especially the rarer disorders like DID. So because most people haven't interacted with anyone with DID, most of the information they have about it is likely to come from stigmatizing media, which makes it harder for people who have DID to be visible about our experiences. And a lot of the stigma that exists also extends to the field of psychology. You have a lot of therapists who don't believe DID exists at all. A lot of intro to psych classes will describe it as, this is a term that exists, most of us don't believe in it, we'll watch the movie Sybil and move on. The movie Sybil is a wildly inaccurate depiction of DID, and it's since been proven that the woman it describes, Sybil, did not actually have DID. So you can imagine how that goes. But our psychiatrist told us about a year ago that most therapists will not knowingly take on a client who already has a DID diagnosis. And we did find this in our personal experience to be the case, because DID is also accompanied by almost always anxiety, depression, PTSD, but can also be accompanied by disorders, personality disorders, eating disorders, psychosis, and schizophrenia. So most psychologists, a lot of therapists will just not want to deal with everything you come with. So our psychiatrist told us that we should pretend we didn't have a diagnosis, wait for a therapist to give us their own diagnosis and take it from there, which is a lot of work just to find out if a therapist will work with you at all. So we, after about 6 months and several traumatic therapy experiences, we did find the therapist we have now, who is a blessing. And while we're on the topic of therapy, so there's really a good kind of therapy for DID and a bad kind. And it can be easy to assume that the way to treat DID is to get rid of the system, which is not the case. The thing about DID is the problem with it is not the presence of the system, it's the trauma that caused it. So you want to treat DID for PTSD. But you've got the bad kind of therapy, which insists on the idea of integration, which is mashing all the alters back up into one person. And for a very, very small number of people with DID, this is a desirable solution. But for most of us, who knowingly wants to not exist tomorrow. So the good kind of therapy leaves that decision up to the person with DID and their system. So our current therapist, the first session we had with her, she asked us if we were interested in integration. We said no, and she has not brought it up since. What she has told us is that in systems like ours, where communication is sound, that DID is one of the healthiest coping mechanisms the brain has for dealing with trauma. So we're all very close in our system. We look out for each other. If Ross is having a tough time, someone else will step in so they don't have to front until they're more stable. And we, in our personal experience, DID has been a very good thing that came out of something horrible. Ross again. So just sort of in closing here, I just wanted to emphasize, again, like CSA and DID are both deeply misunderstood and super stigmatized, and that leads to silencing. Stigma is always used as a tool of suppression, which makes it hard for people to talk about their experiences, for people to empathize with experiences that they can't personally understand, and it allows people like Kevin Spacey to get away with it. So like empathy is the biggest thing we can stress here today. Just please care about children, listen to children when they talk about experiences, listen to any survivors when they are able to talk about their experiences, and look out for each other. Thank you.